Aloha and good day. This is Clint Hansen with Maui Luxury Real Estate, broadcasting on the KAOI radio group. This is a wonderful Monday morning, and I have two wonderful guests with me, Byron Yap of Axia Home Loans and Paul Brewbaker, who's one of our top state economists. Thank you so much, Paul and Byron, for coming and helping with the show today.
Thank you.
So on everybody's mind, of course, is inflation and housing prices. Where are things at and where are they going? Don't have a crystal ball. It's kind of hard to tell, but certainly as the feds are starting to try to grapple with potential inflation coming on, they seem to see things, right around, from my understanding, like 7% mark. When you're in the grocery store, it's kind of a different story. They can definitely be at a higher percentage than that. So can you talk a little bit about, how inflation is measured, and so we can get a better understanding of how that's affecting the average person?
Sure. I think this question of measurement is really an important one right now because there are different forces at work. They manifest themselves in different parts of the ways we measure inflation. And in turn, because they're different, they call for different kinds of economic policy responses. You mentioned the Federal Reserve, the monetary policy authority, who help determine where interest rates are and supply liquidity to the financial markets and whatnot, and have a lot of influence over interest rates, particularly at the short end of what's called the yield curve. The longer term interest rates are more market determined, so where mortgage rates are a little bit more market determined, but importantly, embed people's inflation expectations. So a thing the Federal Reserve is trying to do is to keep inflation expectations well anchored at the 2% policy objective, but they can only control certain things. And the shortage of semiconductors going into a brand new Ford F-150 is not one of those things. And so we have to understand these two separate forces. It's helpful to look at the data. So me, I got to show you the data.
Please do, please do.
Hawaii is running at about 6% inflation, which means, by the way, that all the stuff you hear in the news, and this is literally called the headline inflation rate, because it's what the news is going to try to get you to freak out about. So you'll tune in tomorrow to see the update. What the media are talking about is a 7.5% U.S. inflation rate, which, as the headline says, is the highest in 40 years if you don't live in Hawaii. It turns out in Hawaii, it's not higher than it was in 2006 at the peak of the housing bubble then, which in turn was not higher than in 1990 at the peak of the housing bubble then, the Japan bubble, and not to mention, well below where we were in 1980. And indeed, we've spent 40 years, or the Federal Reserve has spent 40 years conducting monetary policy to get inflation expectations down to the 2% we had pre-COVID that you're looking at right here. We had gotten there, people were comfortable with it. Inflation was not an issue until about 5 seconds ago. And indeed, inflation was not an issue until exactly 1 year ago. Like a light switch, in March of last year, inflation blew up. And you may well ask, what the hell happened in March of 2021? The American Rescue Plan Act. Remember, everybody got a check in the mail, and everybody's kind of like, I just got vaccinated. I've already gone back to work. Do I need a check? But I'll take it. And so we all went out and spent money. And that's a part of what's going on there. It's helped to that event, that third of three major fiscal stimuli, the CARES Act in March 2020, which was more business and corporate oriented, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was a sort of top off the tank of the PPP loan program at the end of 2020, and then this much more household and consumer oriented package in March 2021 poured a little too much fuel on a fire that was starting to burn as people began to go back to normal. And on the other side, that we're talking about the demand side of the markets. On the supply side, there were still lockdowns at the factories in China that were making all the stuff that we were buying. So you can see some of that if you split up the components of the urban Hawaii Consumer Price Index. You can see that two things are happening right now. One is just oil prices. So oil was, let's do some arithmetic. At $80 a barrel pre-COVID, we were driving around in our Ford F-150s, and then oil fell to $40 a barrel. By how much did petroleum prices deflate? The answer is by 50%, from $80 to $40 a barrel. And then they went back to $90 a barrel. By how much did oil prices inflate? Well, about 120%. And so that's the headline, 120% inflation. But of course, oil just went back to where it was pre-COVID, more or less, plus a risk premium for the incipient Ukrainian invasion. But outside oil, as you mentioned, food, there's some issues in the food supply chain. We should keep our eyes on housing. You can see the shelter costs have, at the lower end of the spectrum here, have been relatively muted, but that may, right as we take off the rent controls and the moratoria and so on, and as these recent home prices sort of build into the cost of shelter generally, right? It's a high home price is a problem if you're buying a home, but for the 97% of people who are just living in their home, it's like whatever. Yeah. And then you have these anomalous, right? Everybody went out and bought a car, but there aren't enough chips to actually manufacture the cars. So then people said, well, let's buy a used car. And now used car, and you see at the top of the list here, well, the way to avoid used car inflation is not to buy a used car for 5 minutes. So a lot of this stuff is stuff that just has to work out in the supply chain. And when you break down the headline consumer price index, which are the solid dots here, and separate out the food and energy costs. So you take away, for people who don't eat or drive, right, you take away the food and energy costs. You get about 2 percentage points of the inflation rate in the headline component over what's called the core rate, the core index that extracts the food and energy, which in turn is about 2 percentage points above what would have been the underlying trend anyway, about 2%. So you get these three pieces, the 2% trend, which is the goal, and then you get the 2% that's coming from this macro event, the stimulus run amok, let's say, a little bit overdone. And it's like triage, right? You don't worry too much about the details. You stop the patient from bleeding and then get them to the emergency room. And then you have this 2% that's coming from the supply chain disruptions and anomalies like what's happening with the motor vehicular manufacturing process. Canadian truckers are blocking the bridge so the parts can't get to Michigan. That kind of wacky stuff. And it'll sort itself out. But as you pointed out, and I think most relevant for the housing market, the Fed is positioned and has let everybody know that they are winding down their asset purchases. They'll conclude next month. That liftoff for the overnight interbank lending rate will begin next month. They've already told us this. At least 25 basis points. It's essentially zero now, but starting a process of raising the short-term rate. And as Byron will tell us, mortgage rates have already moved on out as long-term interest rates have risen, anticipating where the Fed is going to want to end up, which is, the Fed's going to want to end up in a range around 2 to 2.5% for risk-free interest rates, short-term and long-term. And when you add 175 basis points to that, you get up to about a 3.50 to 4% mortgage rate when everything's at the post-COVID steady state new normal.
And what are you seeing right now, Byron, in terms of rates out there?
Well, like Paul had said, the market is pricing it in ahead of time in anticipation of March. I mean, we've seen rates from December, they were maybe 3.25. In this short span of the year, they're little over 4%. They're still on shaky ground because, the war, like Paul was saying, oil, these kind of things they're still bouncing in the air. So, and I think it's really going to depend on what happens in March. We'll probably see a settling period, but every day it's different. Like one day it'll drop down, next day you'll have 3 price changes because the bond market tanked. Yeah. So it's an uneasy period right now. And I think this month has shown it to be a real uneasy. It's probably in all the financial things that's happening out there, the direction of what are the Feds going to do? How much are the Feds going to do it? So we're seeing the uneasiness. I think March will probably, like Paul, I think was indicating, it'll probably get a little more flatlined of what we're going to see the Feds do. One question I did have for Paul, the 2% you said as a basis for inflation, the 2% number that we want to go around. Why are we picking 2%? Why did the government, or why do we say 2%, not 1% or 4%?
Yeah, what's
You
that
know,
baseline?
that's a really good question. 25 years ago, a prominent economist who you might have heard of, Ben Bernanke, wrote a book called Inflation Targeting, at which time he proposed that if monetary authorities, having successfully, beginning with Paul Volcker, gotten the inflation down over a period of a decade and a half, and you could see we were headed into greener pastures and less inflation risk. The idea was if all the central banks got onto the same page and convinced everybody in the financial markets and whatnot to come along with them and kind of agree on a number, then you could view deviations from that number in the short term as reflecting transitory phenomena, that we just live with that. Or sometimes oil goes up, sometimes oil goes down. But otherwise, if you can count on a 2% inflation environment, let's say, arbitrarily over time, then everything else can be planned around that. And so, for example, a 4% mortgage rate in a world in which the inflation rate is going to be 2%, almost guaranteed, is a world in which 2 percentage points of what you're paying is inflation, expected inflation. But the other 2 percentage points is essentially a real cost of credit with zero inflation risk premium. And you just used some language a second ago that alluded to the turbulence and volatility and uncertainty of this particular moment. We sort of all know where we're going to be in March. There's a question about whether there's a 25 or 50 basis point move. But we got the Russian thing going on, and there's this wacky thing going on in the supply chain. And we're just trying, should I mask up? Should I not mask up? We're just trying to get back to normal. And as that uncertainty abates, Bernanke wrote many years ago, it's useful to have kind of a benchmark that we can all fall back on. And then the question becomes, how credible is the monetary authorities' commitment to that benchmark? As they build credibility, as I say, everybody gets on board. Why 2%? It's technical. It's harder to break away from a deflation than it is to modulate or tamp down an inflation. So you sort of never want to go negative. Negative is just, nobody understands negative interest rates, negative inflation, not even economists. The way we measure inflation, we talked about the consumer price index, all those components, those pieces are all moving around. The way we measure things, we have to be careful because, this wasn't in the consumer price index when this was in the consumer price index, not to mention when there were no cell phones. So because of technological progress, new products and so on, and we're switching away from the old stuff to the better, faster, cheaper stuff. It was decided, the Boston Commission in the 90s decided that realistically about 1 percentage point of measured inflation is probably comprises biases that come from the inadequacies in the way we measure it. And so if you don't want to go negative, there's a percentage point of bias, but you want to have enough of a cushion so you never go so close to zero, you risk going, and, kind of just add an extra percentage point. That's literally that much complexity. And that's where the number 2 came from. And, it could be 1.75, but,
Okay.
it's just easier to remember in a Monty Python kind of 2 is the number and the number is 2 kind of way. So.
Well, as an example I hear all the time from people, some of my friends, is that, hey, Byron, everything is going up, but my wages aren't going up. Oil, like you said, is going up $2 or whatever, but my income isn't going up. So how is the Feds, or how is it going to help me with this inflationary part?
This is a really good question. So let's think about this for a second. I look out there and let's say everybody's gotten on board. 2 is the number is 2. We actually, we actually kind of been there for 20 years, except for deviations, which come and go. And so if everybody's on board, but your wages aren't rising at least 2% per year, you need to think about what you're doing relative, right? Because there's probably somebody out there who's doing better than that, and they have no problem with 2%. So again, because we have a common yardstick, now we can begin to it informs a lot of other economic decisions we're making. Like if my company's product prices are not rising at that fast, or for example, if I'm committed to keeping my prices constant, is my quality rising enough over time so that I'm always looking better, faster, or cheaper? You see what I mean? In a real sense, these are all things in a stable inflationary environment that are easier in which to engage in terms of economic decision making, production decision making, life, occupational choices, and so on.
Artificial scarcity being one of those.
and when you see the price of a random board length of lumber go from $300 a board foot to $1,600 a board foot, you need something against which to benchmark that movement, whether it's temporary or not. It's freaking $1,600 a board foot. I'm switching to steel studs or something. You see what I mean? We make decisions. My son bought a some big ass SUV, 2005 model Chevy Suburban for $5,000. I said, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm flipping it." He sold it for $8,000. So that's okay. Some people do Bitcoin. He's doing used cars right now. I mean, these things all send prices send signals, and it's useful to have a benchmark against which to compare. A really important signal that it should be sending to young people: if your wages aren't rising, if you don't anticipate that you're going to be able to create enough productivity growth in your skills and productive capacity to earn at least 2% more per year in the long run of things. I get sometimes you stick with a job for a while, you learn the skills, and then you get a big bump up when you move to a new employer or to get a promotion or whatever. But if you don't see that, then you need to be thinking about whether you're accumulating the skills that you do need.
Yeah,
because
necessary.
Your competition is East Asia and East Africa. You know what I mean? If you're a young, unskilled worker, right, your competition is in Addis Ababa. So at the other end of the Silk Road, there's some guy that's hungrier than you that's willing to work harder for less money. And so anyway, believe it or not, it all ties together.
For the effect on interest rates that I'm seeing right now, it hasn't had any impact whatsoever on the real estate market on the upper side. So anything that's above $1 million or whatnot. And I still have a plethora of buyers in the lower price points.
Sure.
So when a more affordable condo comes in, instead of having 15 to 20 offers, I'm getting 6 to 7 offers. So still, there's plenty of demand there, and the main issue, of course, is supply. And I'm starting to see some people make the decision to list. There is some microscopic increases in inventory, but not nearly sufficient to meet with demand. So, inevitably, I think prices will continue to rise. But the question is, of course, how much more interest rates are going to be changing. And again, I think that's going to be more effective of those lower price points as opposed to the higher ones, because they're usually paying cash anyway.
Here's another important way to think about that 2% inflation benchmark, the sort of goal, the policy goal. If you look at my single family and condominium prices over the broad sweep of 30, 40, 50 years of history, it turns out the appreciation rate is about 4 to 5% before adjusting for the 2% inflation. And if you take out the inflation, it was higher in the past, it's lower now. The real appreciation rate is 2% per annum. You would think, wow, only 2%. Well, compounding and so on and so forth. And of course, that's the capital gain. The dividend is you get to live in the house. So when you put that together, the total return makes it worth borrowing, getting mortgage finance at 4% all day long.
Yeah.
But it is interesting how in a world in which inflation is not as much of a risk as it used to be, and I think we still live in that world despite the concerns right now about short-term properties of inflation, a world in which you can plan for the next 30 years of, let's say 4% home price appreciation, 2 percentage points of which is inflation, is a relatively stable world in which you can put your energy into thinking about other things than whether I'm going to be able to afford a house down the road.
Mhm. That's one of the things I'm really surprised, though, with scarcity being what it is, and I understand where it comes, at least locally, the fact that so many people have the ability to work from anywhere, and actually have been for a long time, but with so many jobs on the West Coast of the US, being in the digital space anyway, now they've been given specific instructions to not come into the office and are demanding to be able to work from anywhere forever. And they're even willing to take pay cuts. So that has created, a significant increase in demand here. And, there's a lot of jobs out there that you can work from home. There's people that are therapists, and online therapy is becoming significantly more popular nowadays. And, being able to meet your clients wherever they are in a safe environment allows you to get to more of them. And, the margin goes up and you can be anywhere in the world. Where would you want to be? Obviously, Maui is on the top of a lot of people's minds. And it's been really tough for people who live and work on island. I've definitely noticed a strong portion of the population just immediately exited when COVID hit. And
Sure.
now I'm seeing additional people leave the island because of increases in rent, or the inability to find a replacement rental. And that's been really tough. I mean, I've lost friends to the mainland and clients because of basically that action. And I've been talking to the county for a long time. As we oftentimes get asked to interview and testify. And since as long as I've had my license, I've been saying, look, even through 2008, I was like, we have a massive detriment of available inventory. We cannot meet, the local demand, let alone the people that are coming in. And it isn't within the county's power to create housing specifically for people who live and work on island. I mean, it's not a violation of the Constitution or anything like that. Resale, on the other end, that's a different bag of tricks, and there's community land trusts and things like that available. But I'm happy to see, after significant pressure over decades, they're starting to institute policies where they can issue a bond and create infrastructure and then sell developable areas, as opposed to relying on massively wealthy developers that can do the project and are willing to carry a project for 15, 25 years to get those entitlements, as opposed to making the county responsible for where things are going to be built and what's going to be built there. So there is potential improvement, but I don't know how we're going to ever meet that magical shortfall number, whether it's 5,000 or 10,000.
Well, I think it's an issue of dialing the periodic flow of new housing units up enough, right? It's not like there's a number,
Yeah,
but there's a flow of new units, which clearly is inadequate
way inadequate.
currently and has been for a while. That's leading to the kinds of outcomes that you talked about. People vote with their feet, right?
Yeah.
Exit, voice, and loyalty. Wasn't that the name of the book? This, the guy who came up with the expression "voting with their feet" wrote this book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, I think it was. Anyway, about this very phenomenon where you give enough power, political power, to local people who are going to preempt capital formation, new home building, and so on. And what you see is the segregation you talked about, right? The rich people don't care; they can afford to do whatever they want.
Yeah.
If they're building one, massive home for themselves, and hey, it's their land, it's their money, get out of their face. They can do that without any restriction being imposed by the county, because it's just one house. But when you get people who just want to build, multifamily dwellings for regular working people, all of a sudden they've got to jump through these hoops.
Yeah.
This is how much you have to build of this, and this is how much you got to build of that. And they're like, get out of my. So, and what we've seen is that the requirements, the quotas, they're called inclusionary zoning requirements, but they're production quotas. That the production quotas are in themselves the suppressing factor. And the problem is, as I say, it's a reflection of a bona fide resident political aspiration to manage development. But the outcome, perversely, is one in which
the opposite
wealthy
of its
investors
intended.
can do whatever they want, and the people of more modest means are shorted the opportunity to get the house that they want. It's not like Maui doesn't have enough land. I'm sorry, man. When you come from an island like Oahu, which, let's face it, a little smaller, and Maui doesn't want to be Oahu. Okay, whatever. Oahu doesn't want to be Singapore. Yeah, whatever. I mean, okay, I get that. You can't tell me there's not enough. You could just carve out one place to put all of the affordable housing. So it's right boundaries and bandwidth. I get the boundary thing. We're really good at that, but we don't have the bandwidth to get the product out to the market.
I had a question, because I'm just a layman. I don't really understand the economy part, but in my mind, I'm thinking, why wouldn't we lower short-term? I know we're at zero, but lower the short-term rates, because then the money is cheaper, so the people can afford these things. From a layman's perspective, why is that wrong?
No, Byron, you're not wrong, and we just did that. We've been doing that for like a decade, as it turns out. If you look back at the historical record, this has been an extraordinary moment in economic history for anybody, not just people of more modest means, to finance residential investment. But of course, it financed all investments, from hedge funds, to meme stocks. But you're right. Yes, we went through the worst recession since the Great Depression 10 or 12 years ago. And the recovery from that, because it was rooted in housing, the recovery from that recession was long and drawn out, needed the Fed to keep its pedal to the, keep the gas pedal, keep his foot on the gas pedal. And what in the historical record are relatively low interest rates for a long, long time. And 4% is not expensive mortgage finance. I hate to say
remember
it.
the 1980s.
No, and I agree too.
Yeah,
it's just
people
I think maybe the problem was, in my mind, we held it too long. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's what. Yeah, absolutely. That's what's happened in the last 12 months. We've awakened to find out, holy crap, how we have 7.5% inflation nationwide. Yeah, because everybody pretty much had the stuff they needed, and then the Treasury all sent them a check for $1,000.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll buy more stuff. I mean,
well, that's the whole thing, is because I think it was held too long, too low. You know what I'm saying? And now, the norm is 4, which is still low, but in everybody's mind, the last 10 years, we've had it at 3% or lower.
Yeah, like 5 minutes ago, it was 3%.
So you see, I mean, as we go into this, do you the easing or whatever the government's going to do, would it be safe to say, or possibly, that we're heading into, they're going to try to stop this inflation, to curb it down by lowering the rates and doing other things that maybe we don't see to help us? Or what is your
they're the short term, the short term. I mean, there are not that many tools to dampen inflationary pressure, but unfortunately they all involve an overweight man sitting on everybody and crushing the inflation for a while. And it's just like the Paul Volcker slam dance in 1980, only we're not starting at 18% inflation. We're starting at 7.5%, maybe half of which is really macro in character. And we're looking around for the biggest sumo guy we can get to come sit on the economy with higher interest rates for about a year. But the other 3 percentage points is, as we talked about earlier, about resolving disarticulation in the supply chain. And some of that just came from the fact that, it's like with housing. Seemed like everybody thought when COVID first hit, oh, there goes housing investment, there goes residential construction. And we all prepared for a great winter of low residential investment. And what happened was the summer of 2020 was just the opposite. Everybody pimped out a home office and residential construction exploded. The problem is the sawmill shut down. They shut down because of COVID. And then everybody showed up like, bro, I need some studs, man. Where's my lumber? And bro, that was 2 years ago, and we're still. It's like when you throw a big rock into a pool and the waves ripple out, the reverberation. We're still going through that.
Now we're having choke points at harbors throughout the world.
Yeah,
and the solutions to those things are only long-term in nature. Like, oh yeah, we'll build more bridges. Okay, that'll take 10 years, and then but hey, I'm all in favor of infrastructure investment. Clinton mentioned, wow, the county just discovered that they could issue bonds and improve infrastructure, which, to be fair, I've worked with a group over there in the mayor's office and whatnot. And with every mayor's office, by the way, this has been going, we've been having a conversation for decades, 10 or 20 years, but it came up after the COVID moment because, what can a jurisdiction do when it can reasonably anticipate that there's a risk that their tax revenues not showing up? The answer is you still have a AAA bond rating, right? Municipal bond finance only costs you like 200 basis points. The Fed's guaranteeing you free money, and you have a AAA rating. Just borrow some money and go add some lanes, and let's stop the head-on collisions by having multi-lane divided roadways. It's something. I don't care. Build some more sewage treatment capacity if you're worried about non-point source pollution from the injection wells and wherever. And so, to their credit, the wheels of the bureaucracy have been grinding slowly towards this solution. Yeah, well, the old codgers will all tell you. I heard this from who's your mayor now?
Victorino.
Yeah.
Victorino, Mike.
Yes, I used to say Shane's dad, and that used to drive him crazy. So, Mayor Victorino, brother, he was around back in the 60s. When all of that A and B housing was built, when Maui's population had declined for 40 years until statehood. And then in the 1960s, things turned around. And a big part of it was the county actually building infrastructure, right? The territorial government and later the state government and the county facilitating residential development by providing the roadways and the water mains and the sewage treatment capacity.
How everywhere has been doing it forever.
Well, the way we all used to do it, right? You pay for infrastructure over a long duration by creating the assets from which the property taxes are generated and the user fees to pay down the debt.
Simple,
right? And somewhere along the way in the 1970s, the hippies showed up, and we all were smoking ganja or something, and decided we would stick it on the man, and we would make the developer build the road, and we make the developer build the school, and we make the rich, evil capitalist developer build the water infrastructure because it's free, because he's rich and he's a capitalist. And now we don't have any houses. So, yeah, my impression is the creative minds over at the county have been able to get together and get something going. And then, of course, the federal government, the Congress actually came through on, at least one thing the new administration wanted, which was this big infrastructure package. So we'll see, but that does, to your question earlier, Byron, that doesn't get us low inflation in the next 6 months.
Well, Warren Buffett said, and like you mentioned, the big fat man is that the Fed has very little tools to control inflation, but the one tool that they have is a tremendous brake pedal, and that's the interest rate. They do not have a particularly good gas pedal, so they have to be very careful about their incremental increases. So
it's the old pulling on a string problem. They can when you push on the string, it just goes limp. It's like
So I'm positive about the future. I definitely think that we're going to see things stabilize. Hopefully we won't see prices continue to jump up at the same rate that they have been, but I think that's all going to depend on available inventory and people's decision what they're going to be doing for the future in conjunction with interest rates, because at some point people will pay anything to be in Maui. And if their price range is $1 million and Akihe Village is the only thing that's $1 million, they're going to buy it because we have the best weather in the world. And it's there next to the beach, even though historically, they might have sold at less than $500,000. Now they're 550 to 675,000, depending on the location that they are in the complex, which is really quite an amazing jump in a short amount of time. So the only real alleviation is to help local people out. And by that, they need to increase infrastructure, tell us what we want, and tell them where you can build what, and then the developers will take care of the rest.
We'll have to leave for another time the conversation about when we move all of Kihei on the other side of Piilani Highway, because I'm sorry, Azeka's Market is the beach. You know what I mean? And once the ocean is going to be inside you guys, so we got to figure out. But that's another radio show. I would add two things that support your optimism. One is that a lot of the concern I hear about, these new carpetbaggers coming to Maui because they can work remotely and so on and so forth. First of all, we are them. I mean, we are actually doing this on Zoom. But second, it's not clear to me how that's a bad thing. They have, people complain, the tourists come and they drive to Hana. Yeah, not if you're working from home. So try to, and then here's the other thing about that. 5%, 3.5% of American workers work from home full-time pre-COVID. About 90%, 89.5% of workers never or almost never worked from home pre-COVID. So 90% never did, less than 5% did full-time, and maybe 5 or 10 percentage points worked in hybrid arrangements. They went to the office some days a week, they could work from home some of the time. Now that's going to be 20 to 30%. That are going to be either working remotely full-time or in a hybrid arrangement. A quarter of the workforce is going to be engaged in this new kind of work lifestyle, home lifestyle. But it's a one-time, right? Before we called it shirking from home, and you're working from home. Shirking from home. And your HR department wasn't going to ever let your company conduct the experiment on what would happen if a quarter of us worked from home. Then COVID forced us to conduct this experiment simultaneously, and we all got Zoom, and here we are. So it's a one-time shift. It's a productivity enhancing shift for the people with skills, not so much for the people who don't have the ability to do that. That's a whole other issue. But once you've made the shift, you've probably made the shift. And 2 years out from the start of COVID in America, I think we're closer to the end of the shift. So it's not like there's another 5 percentage point or 10 percentage points or 20 percentage points of households across America that are clamoring to live on Maui because they can work from Maui. I think it's a one-time thing, and all the people that were going to bust a move probably have by now. And then there's a couple guys who realized, as many people who come here from the mainland do, I can't live here, so I got to get off this rock. So I think the concern about this, invasion of alien creatures,
symptomatic, not causal.
And it's a one, to the extent it's happened at all, it's probably a one-time event. What's striking is if you look at the percentages of offshore buyers in Maui home sales, it's actually lower today, right? The percentage of resident buyers is at its highest level of the last, I only have 15 years of data, but it backtracked just a little because of this COVID moment.
I see.
But generally, the proportion of resident buyers has never been significantly higher. And the only time it was 2 seconds before COVID. There are actually fewer offshore buyers in Maui than, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago or even 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And a lot of that had to do with, during 2009.
It was
a big disparity in the American dollar compared to the Canadian. So we had tons of Canadians.
There's the Canadian thing.
They made up like 60% of the buyers at that point.
But I mean, there was a big fire sale. Let's face it. There was a big fire sale in 2010.
And they got a double discount because they had the monetary difference.
There you go. People the Canadians, because the price of the Canadian dollar is the price of oil. So let me tell you, at $90 a barrel, you may be having more of them coming to Kihei, right?
Yeah.
That's
So
I haven't. Yeah.
that being said, you know, one of the things I see a lot of people happy when they're like, oh, good, Maui's population numbers are dropping. You know, that's good. But, you know, that actually, from what I've read, actually causes an effect where home prices continue to increase because the people who are leaving is often the skilled labor necessary to build additional housing. So that shortfall in skilled labor ends up being a feedback loop where additional people leave because prices are increasing and they can no longer afford to live here. You know, rents get increased and, you know, there's no available properties. So they're going to go to the mainland where auntie or uncle live.
I think it's dangerous to generalize, but to the extent you can, I think the idea that population decline is a good thing is ludicrous. And I mean, go ask people in Detroit how they like 40 years of scraping abandoned home sites, right? Because of population loss. So if you're losing population, it's generally speaking a sign that something is really amiss in the economy, and customarily not something people celebrate, except for the guy, you know, for the wealthy dilettantes who would love to see the peasants get off their island.
Precisely. Most of the people that I see glad about those numbers dropping are generally the
guys
higher
who just
income
moved
earners.
there. Yeah.
They move here and they're like, yeah, oh, you know, we don't need so many people on Maui. It's like, wait, where are
I
you
want
from?
Maui to be the way I imagined it was before I got here. Yeah, dude, it was never like that. We worked in the cane field, so
I love it.
In the past, you know, like with inflation numbers when they got high,
Mm.
what was the end result? Was it a collapse in the market or they got it under control? What are some of the cases, you know, for the listeners and viewers, you know? 'Cause
Yeah,
there's a
sure.
fear, you know, I've got a fear too, you know, it's like inflation, you know, what have been the
Yeah,
outcomes
yeah.
of some of them?
Well, first of all, it is important to recognize that what we're talking about is nothing close to what it's like when it gets really bad. So I just want to make sure people aren't, you know, having heart attacks or whatever about. I mean, you guys, I don't think either of you are quite as old as I am, but the 70s, for example, was a period in which inflation gradually increased over about a decade and a half from the war in Vietnam and the war on poverty. So fiscal stimuli of the 1960s, and then some monetary policies, which now in retrospect we recognized were not credibly committed to lower inflation, which is dangerous because then once people start gambling that you're not going to be able.
You there?
Am I still here?
Yeah.
Once
I hear
people you get it into their head that they don't think you're going to be able to control inflation, they all go out and negotiate with their union for a 6% annual wage increase. And then the thing becomes self-perpetuating. That's really what we're trying to avoid here, right? Is turning this thing into a momentum game. But just to be clear what we're talking about, because it's one thing to invoke history and another thing to sort of see a representation of it. Here are Hawaii inflation rates since the World War II era. So, I mean, when you look at these big inflation spikes over the decades past, you realize generally they're associated with some kind of disruption like World War. And I labeled this one in the mid 70s. This is when OPEC really began to be able to flex its muscles as a collusive oligopoly cartel of national petroleum exporting countries. But in fact, it was the outcome of an oil embargo by some of the countries that were on the losing side of what's called the Yom Kippur War in the fall of 1973, I believe it was. And so even then, and you see the Iranian Revolution and so on. So high inflation, it tends to be corrosive in two ways. The obvious way is that fewer and fewer and people are able to keep up. Fewer and fewer people are able to get a 10% wage increase just because there's a 10% inflation rate, because the businesses are being blown up by their production costs are going up and so on. But the second is that it just becomes really hard when it's embedded in the way people think about the economy. What we call inflation expectations. It just becomes really hard to root it out once people have built that into the way they think about approaching negotiating contracts and whatnot. So
now we have the new aspect of the meme economy. The meme economy,
well,
as
there
it
you go.
grows, and when people start getting more serious about putting memes out there of the inflation and how it's affecting their lives, I think that's going to be the point where, maybe using some more heavy-handed tactics.
Well, this is definitely the new frontier for us, because we've seen how misinformation and disinformation have been disruptive in their own right in other areas that maybe aren't as pervasive as, inflation is sort of like the atmosphere, right? It's happening all around us all the time. And it's abstract in the sense there's not really that much we can do about it individually except for avoiding it. And that's an important point too, right? You don't have to buy a used car. So if it's contributing 30 percentage points to the overall inflation rate of 6%, it's basically the 6% inflation in Hawaii is a weighted average of all components. And so there are some components like petroleum, liquid fuel prices that maybe are more difficult to avoid than others. But there's some like used cars, really? Okay. So, if beef is becoming more expensive, well, maybe buy pork for a while. I mean,
what
like surfing.
True. No, for the listeners that don't see the graph, what we saw is a graph from 1940 to now, different inflationary periods. What I noticed on that graph was there was war-related items, there was OPEC. The one thing that stuck out to me is this is the first time a disease or something is on there, which is kind of an unknown where it's going to go or what it's going to do, because our economy has changed from years past being more of a global economy. Correct me if I'm wrong there. So we don't really know how this post-COVID thing is going to turn, because this is the first time of an event like this in the last, what, 80
actually
years?
there is some guidance from history. I just don't have a Honolulu or an urban Hawaii now. And by the way, my apologies to you. Maui is now a metropolitan statistical area, so you've joined. Sorry to say that Maui has joined Honolulu as part of the urban Hawaii Consumer Price Index. I just don't have data before 1940. But the last pandemic in 1920 and 21, I would have to look up. I'm not going to make any assertion about its inflationary impacts. I do think, though, it's important that we talked about the lights, like the light switch, it's like inflation lit up after March of last year because of the nature of the fiscal stimulus, the timing and its large size. And in retrospect, I would have to say maybe too large, maybe 1 trillion would have done it. Maybe 2 trillion was over the top. But of course, you don't want policy to be inadequate. There's at one moment you may be willing to take on a risk that in retrospect looks ill-advised. At any rate, it was very sudden, and for that reason, sudden inflation spikes tend to be short-term in nature, and more specifically, something that's happening on the aggregate supply side of the economy, like the supply chain disruptions, is not something that policy on the demand side of the economy can remediate. Monetary policy cannot solve the supply chain problems. If the price of shipping a container from Shanghai to LA has gone from $1,500 to $10,000 per container, things just have to rebalance before those prices go back down.
What do you think of policies, obviously infrastructure and policies, increasing harbor space and or mobilizing the National Guard in order to have the hands on deck to rectify the bottleneck? Because from what I've read, the majority of the United States reduction of goods comes from California, because there used to be the #1 harbor location, and they've divided it out between, more Western locations, and there's just so much stuff coming in, there's no way to keep up with it.
this is a fascinating area, and I'm no logistics expert, but I hang out with them. Work with the ocean carriers and whatnot. These are fascinating industries. I once bid at a charity auction to be able to take somebody to lunch on one of the Matson container ships, and so we went and ate in the galley container ship, and they were like, "How many people?" This is like an 800-foot long vessel, right? 900-foot long vessel, 3 football fields or something like that. And they're like, how big is your crew? And 18, but actually 3 of those guys we don't need because the union just makes us. So I'm like, holy crap. My point is, these logistics, these supply chains are miracles of modern technology and literally flow management, the ability to manage the flow. I mean, dude, you think I want one thing, I get on Amazon, it shows up at my house tomorrow. That's crazy. But a world in which that's possible, when it's working like clockwork, is amazing. But when it gets disrupted, and then the point you raise is, well, maybe we need 2 San Pedro or Long Beach harbors, but therein lies the dilemma. If you scale, if you scale so that you always have backup, right? We need Pearl Harbor and a backup Pearl Harbor. Well, then you just spent money on a backup harbor that never gets used. And so the way we've come to work these things is to just get the capacity exactly right, and then use computers and satellites to flow the product through the bandwidth.
Efficiency
with super precision and efficiency, and it is vulnerable to disruption. So the experts will be thinking about that. I'm just guilty of buying stupid stuff on Amazon that pops into my head every day.
Oh my! Hey, it was Valentine's, so I'm sure there was a lot of orders out there last minute.
Yeah.
Coming back to housing prices and inflationary effects, and one of the big questions I get asked is, are we in a real estate bubble? And from what I could read, depending on which index you're using, a lot of people like to use the fear index, and or what do they call it? The how excited they are about the economy. I can't think of the word, but we have apparently entered into bubble territory. But from my understanding, looking in the past statistics, we also entered into a bubble back in 1999, and we stayed in that bubble, and it continued to grow until about 2009 with the subprime crisis before the bubble popped. Now, saying that, hey, we're in a bubble, what's your whole interpretation of that?
It's like inflation, where there's a tendency to, if it bleeds, it leads, is kind of the way people approach these things. So you have to be a little careful about throwing the term around. Bubble, technically, an asset pricing bubble technically refers to a situation where there are price movements that don't seem to be grounded in economic fundamentals. So, for example, if a bunch of Redditors and bloggers decide that they're going to take on the establishment by piling into
GameStop
stock, and it bids up the price of what is it?
GME.
Then the bubbleliciousness in that moment is a function of the gamers or whoever herding in that direction. It's called herding. Mm-hmm. And there was evidently, to what I can read about it, an organic grassroots aspiration to blow up the hedge funds who were shorting GME. So that's a really, now that's not happening in Maui's housing market, to be sure, but what we do see is a sudden move in home prices, particularly single-family home prices. And I'll pop the slide up here on quarterly frequencies that happened after COVID. And so you have to ask yourself, given that the trend pre-COVID was relatively stable, was that 4 or 5% trend we were talking about earlier, maybe a little more robust on the condo side of the market, the affordable side of the market, then does the jump in those prices from about 800,000 to a million in about 6 to 12 months in the median Maui single family home price, does that jump represent a bubble per se? And my answer would be no, because I have a plausible explanatory factor coming from this shift in the way we engage in work, right? The remote work phenomenon and the migration that occurred to suburbs and exurbs, and then more broadly to Zoom towns across America, which evidently West Maui, is one. That was a one-time event. I think it's over, and those prices, at least on the single-family side of the market, have started to stabilize, just over $1 million on Maui. Condos also have shown a little less energy in the last few months of last year. So I'm inclined not to think of this as a bubble, but if you put it in the historical context, I understand why it's interesting to conjecture that it might be the start of a bubble, like the one we're looking at coming out
the
of the
graph,
90s.
yeah,
that
you have from the
described,
90s to
that you
2009.
described
Yeah.
a second ago. I mean, that run from 1998, 99 through about 2006, and many people thinking it was still going in 2007 and 2008, but actually it ended from a valuation standpoint in 2006. That run was one of the epic bubbles of the modern era, and of course it precipitated a catastrophic financial collapse, particularly in the non-bank and the shadow banking system,
And that
then
was
gathered up the rest of the economy and threw it into recession. Yeah, we're not headed. I don't think we're headed for that right now.
Yeah. Do you think that the subprime crisis was caused by economic policy or profiteering, or a
Oh
combination?
no, I
of
mean
them?
it's all of the above. I
Yeah.
was a banker in those days. I hung out with mortgage bankers like Byron, and I remember working in an institution that had an ironclad credit culture and that could not understand why anybody would make a subprime loan. But then
Yeah.
I'd be on panel discussions with people, and not that I thought that at the time, or early on anyway, in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was the democratization of credit that was expanding access to credit to single moms and that kind of thing that had never had access before. So there was a good part of it that just got ugly at the end, because once you've banked all the good single moms, there's nobody left except the Slim Shadys. And I was on panel discussions with people. I learned this on a panel discussion one time. Somebody said, "Oh yeah, we make ninja loans." I was like, "What the hell are ninja loans?" No income, no job or assets. The hell kind of a
So
borrow is
you're
that?
giving away money. That's what that is.
So some of it was that, but some of it was, as I just suggested a second ago, we did not understand at the time how big the shadow banking system had become. All of our controls were in the conventional banking system where I lived, and where we rigorously approached risk analytics and risk management, and
That's why you guys didn't have a problem at all.
capitalized,
when
and why
the
we didn't
subprime crisis
collapse.
happened. Yeah.
Why almost no banks collapsed in the last financial crisis.
Yeah.
Because what blew up was over in the derivatives and the shadow banking area. And the thing I would worry a little about right now is fintech, sort of the online lending space, where some of those controls, some of the credit culture that was focused on risk management, safety and soundness and all that stuff.
They don't really work here. Any of those online loan officers typically result in a transaction not happening at all, or switching to a loan on island lender in the last minute. So just everybody listening, do not use an online lender. It is a crisis waiting to happen. And it's one of the reasons I'm constantly referring Byron Yap to people, because he's working with you to make sure that you understand the process. And more importantly, he's reputable. And if he says he can get something done, he'll get it done. Now, we're running out of time, but my last question is, what do you think the potential landmines in the economy are going forward? Obviously disease, climate culture, or, another potential subprime like the commercial loans and things of that nature, because those make up a large block as well.
Byron, what's on your list as a banker?
What concerns?
Yeah.
I mean, I think Clint kind of, I mean, the concern would be, I mean, at least from a just my layman thing is the commercial, because I'm noticing industries are changing their work models, you know, so there's going to be possibly more commercial available. You know, I think that could potentially be something that could maybe wind into the housing, you know, potentially. I think that's the one I'm noticing the most out there. And of course, being on Maui, we don't have all those high tech or tech jobs, you know, that are based here. So I think there's a disadvantage to the local people living here, you know. I mean, but that's probably not part of it, but I'm more pushing toward the commercial side, maybe that side of it, seeing the shift in how businesses like restaurants now. Do you really want to open a restaurant when you can open a food truck, be guaranteed that if a disease comes, you can run it there versus a commercial space?
Yeah, that's, we haven't talked about this at all, but I spend most of my time working in residential data sets because it's close to home, no pun intended for most people. But you're right, because of working from home and for other reasons, the embrace of e-commerce, the realization, the discovery, if you will, that there are channels for distribution of your product or services which do not involve renting commercial space. I think there's a lot of people, property owners, that are looking at tenant leases that are going to expire in the next few years, which will not be renewed, whether it's in office. The one exception might be industrial. But what I hear is office, even retail, has some vulnerabilities, which of course represent opportunities for an innovative, creative thinker to go in and repurpose structures that are already there, but no longer serve a need, which can be served, more efficiently, more profitably through e-commerce channels, or, just, you mentioned food service. I mean, I'm thinking, pickup and delivery and all this other stuff. I mean, the whole app thing has just exploded opportunities in the food service industry that were latent, but because of inertia, hadn't really been pursued. And so that's, I think Clinton was more concerned about, what might fall out of the sky like an asteroid,
right?
And,
Now
and
that's
ruin
a
our
serious
day.
risk.
Well,
That
also
would be.
too, the last part of the commercial part is, we have these lumber costs, right? Then the rate cost. Now the investor looking at the vacant land may say, hey, I don't want to put that commercial building on there now because I can't do I have guaranteed tenants? There might be more, like you're saying, more of the industrial side of it, like Amazon doing that thing in Honolulu.
Last mile fulfillment, bro. Last mile fulfillment. That's what it's all about.
That's what it might transition to.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. We're at the end of our time, but we could certainly talk about this for probably another couple of hours.
Right.
Thank you, Paul.
Paul Brewbaker, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate all your insight and help on this. And of course, Byron Yap with Axia Home Loan. Thank you so much for helping me co-host these shows.
Yep. You have a great day.
Thanks, Clint. Great talking to you, Byron.
Thanks, Paul. Always great. Bye-bye.
Take
Bye,
care,
Clint.
you guys.
Aloha.
Aloha.